Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at expat life, specifically in the Philippines.
All right.
You gave me a really interesting YouTube interview.
Yeah.
It's about this 70-year-old American guy named Peter, and he's living a pretty unusual life in Cebu City.
Yeah, it definitely kind of throws out the window some of the typical images we have about expat life,
Right.
especially when we start talking about finances and relationships.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
just to give everyone a little background, Peter first spent 4 years in Costa Rica, then 5 months in the Philippines,
Okay.
before he decided to stay there for good. What really caught my eye was his claim that he lives like a millionaire on only $2,200 a month.
Oh.
And even more surprising, he has 8 girlfriends.
That's definitely not your average retirement plan.
No.
So how does he manage to live so comfortably on what seems like a pretty small budget?
Yeah, so Peter actually breaks down all his expenses in the interview. His rent for a condo in a Cebu City high-rise is only $340 a month.
Wow.
He claims that a similar place in Atlanta would cost him over $10,000. And he says his other expenses, like groceries and transportation, are significantly lower in the Philippines, too.
Yeah, that huge difference in the cost of living is definitely a big thing that attracts a lot of expats.
Right.
But it's important to remember that affordability comes with its own trade-offs.
Ah.
The quality of infrastructure, healthcare, and other services
Yeah,
can vary a lot from country to country.
exactly. It's all about finding the right balance for your own needs and priorities.
Right.
Speaking of priorities, let's talk about Peter's claim to have 8 girlfriends. He seems very open about this part of his life.
It's one of the most fascinating parts of this interview, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
It really pushes us to think about cultural differences and
Yeah.
the different ways that people approach relationships around the world.
Yeah, you're right. And he actually says that he met most of these women who are between 23 and 46 years old at shopping malls.
Okay.
And he claims that there's no jealousy between them and they all willingly share him.
That brings up a lot of questions, doesn't it? How do these relationships actually work on a day-to-day basis?
Right.
What are the dynamics like?
Yeah, and how does this all fit into the cultural context of the Philippines?
Right.
I mean, are these types of relationships common there? Or is Peter's situation an outlier?
Yeah, that's a key point. While Peter's story gives us a glimpse into one man's experience,
Yeah,
it's really important that we don't generalize about a whole culture based on just one story.
absolutely. And we have to remember, we're only getting Peter's side of the story.
Of course.
We don't know the perspectives or the motivations of the women he's involved with.
Right.
Do you think there's a chance of exploitation in this kind of situation?
It's definitely a possibility,
Yeah.
especially when you have such big differences in age and finances.
Right. And he even mentions that 2 of his girlfriends are actually competing for marriage,
Oh, wow.
and he has to make a decision soon. He even compared it to the reality show The Bachelor.
That comparison is interesting. It seems like he's treating it like a game or a competition, which raises concerns about how seriously he's thinking about commitment and the well-being of the women.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's obvious that Peter's views on love and relationships are very different from what's considered traditional in Western cultures.
For sure.
He seems to be living out a fantasy that many people might find shocking or even morally wrong.
Well, it's important to remember that morality is often subjective
Right.
and influenced by culture. What's seen as inappropriate in one culture could be totally acceptable in another.
Uh-huh.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about the possible ethical problems with these types of relationships,
Right.
especially the chance for power imbalances and exploitation.
Exactly. It's all about having a nuanced and respectful conversation.
I agree.
So we've talked about Peter's finances and his rather complicated love life. What else stands out to you about his experience?
Well, he spends a lot of time talking about how he feels much safer in the Philippines compared to the U.S.,
Okay.
even though he knows that a lot of Filipinos carry guns.
That's an interesting contrast. What does he say makes him feel safer there?
He specifically mentions the security he sees in Filipino malls,
Okay.
like bag checks and metal detectors. He compares that to what he sees as a lack of security in American malls.
That's a recurring thing for him. He spends a lot of time in malls, not just for shopping, but also for meeting people and socializing.
Yeah.
It's clearly a big part of his life in the Philippines.
And that shapes how he sees safety and security.
Right.
It's a reminder that how safe we feel is often influenced by the things we see around us every day and what we do regularly.
Yeah.
What we encounter on a daily basis colors our overall perception of a place.
So Peter feeling safer might not actually be because of lower crime rates,
Right.
but rather because he feels more comfortable and at ease in a place he's familiar with?
Exactly. It's subjective and influenced by personal things and cultural contexts.
His observations about mall security are really fascinating
Yeah.
because they give us a look into his daily life and highlight how different his experiences are in the Philippines compared to the U.S.
And it's also worth noting that Peter's views on safety could be shaped by his age and background.
Okay.
As a 70-year-old American man,
Yeah,
he might be more sensitive to things that seem dangerous and drawn to environments that feel orderly and controlled.
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground already, but there's still so much more to unpack about Peter's story.
Mm.
What do you think so far? Anything that's piqued your interest?
What really strikes me is how Peter's story really challenges what we think it means to be an expat and shows just how different those experiences can be.
Yeah,
It's not just about finding a cheaper place to live.
right.
It's about finding a place that fits with your values, your lifestyle, and your vision of a good life.
I completely agree. And Peter's story, while unconventional, really makes you think about the different ways people try to find that sense of fulfillment.
It reminds us that the world is full of possibilities,
Yeah.
and there's no single right way to be happy.
Well said. We've dug into Peter's finances, his unique relationships, and how safe he feels in the Philippines.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot more to explore, especially the bigger effects of his choices and the ethical things to consider.
For sure.
We'll keep going deeper into Peter's world in the next part of this deep dive. Stay tuned.
Okay. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been talking about Peter's unusual life in the Philippines, and I think it's safe to say his story has brought up some thought-provoking questions.
It really has.
Yeah.
One thing that jumped out at me was Peter's statement about how he thinks life is much better for retirees outside the U.S. He even went so far as to say that America is boring. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a feeling that some expats share, especially those who want a more exciting or less expensive retirement. But we have to remember that it's just one person's opinion, not a universal truth. What one person finds interesting, another might find overwhelming.
That's a good point. It's all about finding what fits your personality and how you like to live. Peter also seemed kind of disappointed with the political situation in the U.S. He even said that he believes America is becoming a dangerous place.
That reflects something we're seeing all over the world with growing political differences and unrest in many places. It makes sense that some people, especially those getting ready for retirement, might look for a sense of stability and security in countries that seem less unstable.
He did seem really drawn to the Philippines because he felt safe there, especially in public places like shopping malls. He even said he felt safer there than in the U.S., even though he knows guns are more common in Filipino society.
That observation shows how our ideas about safety are shaped by the culture we're in and what we've experienced. While crime statistics are important, they don't always tell the whole story.
You're right. It's not just about the numbers. It's about how safe you feel in your everyday life. And for Peter, that feeling of security seems to come from the strict security measures he sees in Filipino malls, like bag checks and metal detectors.
That focus on visible security could be particularly appealing to someone coming from a Western country where those things aren't as common in everyday life. It gives a tangible feeling of order and control, which can be reassuring.
It's also interesting to think about how Peter's daily routine affects his perceptions. He spends a lot of time in malls, not just to shop, but to socialize and meet people, too.
Right, malls are a big part of his experience in the Philippines, so it makes sense that what he sees about mall security would affect how safe he feels in the country as a whole.
It seems like Peter has found a sense of comfort and belonging in the Philippines that he might not have had back in the U.S. He feels accepted and part of the community, and that adds to his overall well-being.
Definitely, security isn't just about physical safety. It's also about feeling connected to a community and having a sense of belonging. When those needs are met, it can create a strong sense of peace and stability.
Peter's story also brings up some interesting questions about why people choose to live abroad. He was very open about wanting to live somewhere he could afford a certain lifestyle and where age wouldn't be a problem for romantic relationships.
That brings us to the topic of older Western men looking for relationships with younger women in other countries, something that's often talked about and sometimes debated in the context of expat life.
It's a complicated issue with a lot of nuances to consider. Peter was very matter-of-fact about his relationships with multiple women, some much younger than him. He even compared it to polygamy, which is legal in some cultures but not in the Philippines.
That comparison, while maybe meant to be funny, can be a problem because it oversimplifies the complexities of polygamy as a social and cultural institution. Polygamous relationships, where they're legal and culturally accepted, have specific rules and traditions. They're not just about having multiple partners, they're about a particular set of social and family structures.
That's an important difference. And it's important to approach this topic carefully, recognizing that there's a possibility for exploitation and power imbalances in any relationship, especially those with big differences in age and finances.
Absolutely. We need to be aware of the ethical considerations, making sure everyone involved has agency and is treated with respect. It's also important to remember that we're only hearing Peter's side. We don't know the motivations or experiences of the women he's with.
Exactly. And while Peter's views on relationships might seem shocking or unusual to some, they might not be that uncommon in certain expat communities. He even said he's met other expats who want to live like him.
That suggests there might be subcultures within the larger expat community that have different norms and values, especially about relationships and gender roles. It reminds us that the expat experience is incredibly diverse, and there's no one story that covers all the motivations, lifestyles, and challenges.
It's important to avoid making sweeping judgments about expat life based on one person's story. Peter's experience is just one piece of a much bigger and more complex puzzle.
Exactly. And it's important to approach these discussions with nuance and an open mind, realizing that there are many different ways to live as an expat, each with its own set of considerations and implications.
Peter's focus on how affordable it is to live in the Philippines also raises questions about economic differences and whether it's ethical to benefit from lower living costs in other countries.
That's a complex issue with no easy answers. On one hand, people have the right to look for a comfortable and affordable lifestyle wherever they can find it, but it's important to be aware of the possible impact on the local economy and to avoid taking advantage of lower wages or living standards.
Peter did say that he feels like he's living like a millionaire in the Philippines on his modest income. He compared his $340 a month condo in Cebu City to a $10,000 plus per month lifestyle in Atlanta, which shows the big difference in cost of living.
That difference can be a big draw for expats, but it also raises ethical questions about how wealth is distributed and whether it creates or worsens economic inequality.
It's a tricky balance. Ideally, expats should try to contribute positively to their new communities, both economically and socially, rather than just taking benefits without giving back.
Exactly. It's about being a responsible global citizen, understanding that our choices and actions can affect the communities we choose to be a part of.
Peter's story is a good reminder that deciding to move abroad, while potentially rewarding, shouldn't be taken lightly. It's important to carefully consider the implications, both personal and ethical, before making such a big life change.
Thorough research, careful planning, and a willingness to engage with the local culture respectfully and responsibly are all crucial parts of a successful expat experience.
I think we've covered a lot in this discussion, from cultural differences and perceptions of safety to the complexities of relationships and economic disparities.
It's been a fascinating look at Peter's unusual life in the Philippines, and it's definitely raised a lot of important questions about expat life in the 21st century.
And we're not done yet. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll go even further into the ethical considerations of Peter's choices and explore what his story tells us about the bigger trends shaping expat life today. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been really digging into Peter's experience as an American expat in the Philippines, and it's clear that his story is about more than just one man's adventures. It makes you think about the bigger picture of expat life.
It definitely does. Peter's choices, especially about relationships and how safe he feels, offer a unique way to look at some of the bigger trends and ethical questions within the expat community.
You mentioned before how Peter feels safer in the Philippines than he did in the U.S., even though he knows that guns are more common there. He seems really focused on the security measures in Filipino malls.
I think it might be more than just about the security guards or metal detectors. Peter's focus on these things could reflect a deeper need for order and predictability in his life, something he might not feel he has back in the U.S.
That's an interesting thought. Could it be that the strict security in Filipino malls gives him a feeling of structure and control that makes him feel more comfortable?
Exactly. Those measures create a clear system, a feeling that someone is in charge and things are under control. This can be appealing, especially for someone who might be feeling a little lost or anxious in a new and different place.
It also connects back to what we were talking about earlier about Peter feeling like he belongs in the Filipino community. Maybe that feeling of acceptance and being part of the community helps him feel safe, even though there are more guns around.
Absolutely. When we feel like we're part of a group, when we have connections and people to support us, we tend to feel less vulnerable and better able to deal with threats. It's not just about physical safety, it's also about feeling good mentally and socially connected.
This brings up a really interesting part of the expat experience that we haven't really talked about yet, the way globalization and increased mobility affect how people see things and the choices they make. Peter's decision to move to the Philippines, even though it seems unusual, is actually part of a bigger global trend.
You're right. We're seeing more and more people choosing to retire or work abroad because of things like lower costs of living, wanting adventure, or just wanting something new. This increased mobility is changing cultures and creating new chances for people from different cultures to interact.
And it's also giving us new challenges, right?
Absolutely. As more people move across borders, we need to be more aware of being sensitive to different cultures, behaving ethically, and the responsibilities we have as individuals living and working in other countries. Peter's story, even though it's unique, gives us a good example to study these complicated issues.
For example, his relationships with multiple younger women bring up questions about power dynamics, consent, and the potential for exploitation. These are touchy subjects, but they're important to talk about, especially as relationships between people from different cultures become more common.
It's about making sure that everyone involved has a choice and that these relationships are based on mutual respect and understanding no matter what their age or culture is.
Peter's story also shows how important economic responsibility is. While there's nothing wrong with looking for a cheaper lifestyle, we need to be aware of how it might affect the local community and avoid adding to or making existing inequalities worse.
It's about being a responsible global citizen, thinking carefully about what we do, and trying to make a positive impact on the places we choose to live.
I think it's safe to say that our deep dive into Peter's world has been really eye-opening, to say the least.
It definitely has. His story, although unusual, has made us think hard about some important things related to expat life relationships between people from different cultures and the ethics of living in a globalized world.
It reminds us that the choices we make affect other people, and that when we look for personal happiness, we should always think about being responsible towards others.
That's an important point. It encourages us to approach living abroad and really any interaction with people from other cultures with humility, empathy, and a willingness to learn and grow from those experiences.
Peter's story is just one example of the many ways people are dealing with the complexities of a globalized world.
Yeah.
It reminds us that there are many different ways to find fulfillment, and that each of those paths has its own challenges and responsibilities.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of expat life. We hope this conversation has given you some new things to think about and encouraged you to think more critically about the choices we make and the impact we have on the world around us.
And remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. We encourage you to keep exploring these ideas and to talk to others about the complicated nature of our interconnected world.